Grand Theft Auto games have us playing through the lens of various protagonists, in different settings and different eras, with each of them either seeking revenge, power and money, or just finding a way out of the criminal life, which never seems to go as planned. None of the GTA protagonists are good guys, not even by a long shot. While some of them may have morals and boundaries that they won't cross no matter the reward, they are still terrible human beings. But when you take a deep dive into any of the stories and the worlds the franchise offers, you'll end up meeting people far worse than even the protagonists. Today I compiled a list consisting of the main villains from each of the games, and try to rank them from worst to best, obviously based on my opinion, so take this with a fistful of salt. At first, I tried to include only one per game, typically your rival throughout the story, and the one you would end up killing in the final mission. But some of the games have us take out even 2 bad guys at once, so the list had to be extended a bit. But I'll try my best to only talk about the most important villains, and only mention other antagonists when it's appropriate. I will also put them in tier list categories as we go along, because why not? Let's begin. We're starting off with someone that I almost forgot to include when I initially made the rankings, Massimo Torini. And if you're scratching your head right now while trying to figure out where he's from or if he's even a real villain, I can assure you he is. Torini is the main villain of Liberty City Stories. However, you can hardly call him that, considering he's barely involved in the story, or at least Tony's story to be more specific. He's the underboss of the Sicilian Mafia, and throughout the story he's orchestrating the fall of the Leones and eventually planning to take over the city. And he does so by allying with both the Diablos and the Triads in order to keep the Leones under constant pressure in the streets as they begin losing influence, territories, and their own men. If we were playing as Salvatore instead of Tony, it would have probably made more sense to have Torini as the main villain. However, we are not. And even if that were the case, he's only featured in one other mission besides the final one, and he probably has a total of 4 dialogue lines in the game. Definitely not a good enough amount of appearances to make him a great antagonist. So he's going in his own separate tier, and he's staying there alone. Personally, I think Vincenzo would have made for a great villain and final boss for Liberty City Stories more than anyone else in the game. He's introduced as Salvatore's capo and the initial boss we get missions from. Acting all superior and treating Tony like a nobody, we quickly grow a sense of hatred or at least some annoyance when he's on screen. Not too long into the game, we're set up by him and forced to run from the cops, only to later receive a call from him asking us to meet and make amends for the sake of Salvatore. The mission where we confront Vincenzo is amazing, as we enter this slasher minigame which is also available in free roam as a side quest. This setup would have been far better as an ending for the game instead of Torini's confrontation with Salvatore. If a few things were changed in the game, and Vincenzo would have stayed around longer, and potentially even betrayed the Leones to join the Sicilians, giving both Salvatore and Tony a proper villain at the same time. However, Rockstar decided to kill him off after the first quarter of the game, and for some reason, Salvatore never acknowledges his death for the remainder of the game, which is quite odd considering he was a capo, as I've mentioned earlier. Not much else to add here, only a disclaimer. I don't hate any game on the list, in fact, quite the opposite. Each Grand Theft Auto game has strengths and weaknesses, and in LCS's case, it's just a few aspects of the story. Overall, the game is really solid, and it's the first handheld game after GTA Advance that really grabbed the fans' attention and love. And since I've mentioned Advance, I think it's a great moment to move on to the next entry in the list, Vinny, the antagonist of the game. He's introduced as Mike's mentor and best friend, as he was the one who took Mike under his wing, and together they worked for the Mafia and had collected a good amount of money over the years. Initially, they planned to leave Liberty City for good and get away from the criminal life. But Vinny strings Mike along and insists on doing a few more jobs before leaving for good. Not long into the game's story, Vinny is apparently killed in a car bomb, leaving the protagonist on a quest for revenge and earning back the money that was gone along with Vinny. We then learn that he had faked his death to keep all the money for himself, calling Mike a stupid kid and just a pawn in his plans. And Mike doesn't take that kindly, killing him without remorse. I know I've said we're talking about people we kill at the end of the game, but he's technically the main villain even though he dies a few missions before that. I mean, the actual final mission has us run away from the police after we confronted King Courtney and his goons. But he doesn't die and is doing perfectly fine during the events of GTA 3. But focusing on Vinny here, he's not necessarily a bad antagonist. He's very much rude, manipulative, and a good fit for the antagonist role. However, his character doesn't have much of a build-up. The story introduces him as a friend, then he's dead, but oh, he's not actually dead, and oh, he's dead because we killed him. And that's it. The story of Advance is actually really good, and if you ignore the occasional plot hole here and there, it does a great job at introducing new characters and expanding the lore. With that being said, I'd put Vinny in D tier. Not the worst entry, but definitely not all that interesting either. And sitting alongside him in the D tier is none other than Sonny Forelli, responsible for the 15-year sentence Tommy received after he's sent into an ambush where he takes out 11 hitmen that were there to whack him. That's also where Tommy earned the nickname the Heartwood Butcher. The reasons as to why Sonny wanted to get rid of him was because Tommy started to gain power and a good reputation on the streets of Liberty City, And even after he got released, afraid of the fact that he might be bad for business, he sends him to expand the operation of the Ferralis down south in Vice City, and the rest is history. Although you get a sense of pressure from Sonny every once in a while whenever he calls you during free roam to check on how the business goes, I feel like he was still a bit underutilized. And although the confrontation in the final mission is really fun and a Scarface but a good ending scenario, Sonny's implication in the story feels less meaningful as Tommy rises to power and takes over Vice City. He's not a bad villain, but there's just better ones, so D tier it is. Now, moving up a tier, I want to talk about 3 villains in particular that are pretty well written, but with some unused potential. Starting off with...
Hey, Slick, it's me!
My knowledge and understanding of GTA 5's lore and characters is somewhat limited. I've played the story about maybe 3 times in total, which, in comparison to the rest of the games, is pretty low. But I still want to include him and another antagonist from the same game that we'll talk about a bit later. Devin's character is very unique in comparison to the rest of the villains we see in prior GTA games. He's not a random thug, nor a gang lord, and not a corrupt government agent or police officer. He's just a billionaire with tons of power and influence and a taste for exotic cars. He uses the characters in a couple of missions to acquire said luxury cars and just never pays any of them. He does, however, introduce Michael to Solomon Richards and the movie business he's really passionate for. Later, after Michael accidentally gets Molly, his personal assistant, killed in a brutal way to put it lightly, Devin attempts to assassinate Michael's family while he attends Meltdown's premiere, but fortunately he gets there in time to save them. After the final heist, Devin visits Franklin and asks him to take out Michael, and dismiss Steve Haynes' previous orders to take out Trevor. Since Ending C is confirmed to be canon, Michael, Franklin, and Trevor come together to get rid of all their enemies, which includes Devin as well. Despite his unique character in comparison to other villains, he doesn't feel as threatening as someone like Steve Haynes, who has a grip on all 3 characters and especially Michael, as he's aware of his and Davy's deal and could have them both arrested at any given moment. Devin's an interesting antagonist, just not exactly top tier. Similar to him is the case for Billy Gray, another entry in the C tier and another character which I really enjoyed, but with an implication in the story that was cut just a bit too short. President of the Lost MC, Billy's character can be summarized as a hot-headed and reckless leader. Shortly after he gets released from rehab, Billy demands Johnny and the other members to get his bike back that was given to the Angels of Death as a peace offering. This results in a shootout between the 2 biker clubs and later a breaking of the truce they had going on prior to that. After destroying the AOD clubhouse and finding a large amount of heroin belonging to the Triads, Billy insists on selling it despite Johnny's hesitation, but he does so anyway, and it ends up being an LCPD bust. Billy then sets up both Johnny and Jim to be ambushed by the Triads in what looked like a simple deal. They escape, but Billy gets arrested after crashing his bike and is sent to Alderney State Penitentiary. There, he's offered a deal by the feds to rat on the gang and join the WITSEC program, which he accepts. Johnny is made aware of this by a phone call from an unknown FIB agent, as well as Congressman Stubbs, who helps Johnny in taking Billy out by infiltrating the prison. You blow up the prison gate, then proceed to make your way past 3,000 guards armed to the teeth, and then find Billy willingly surrendering and accepting his fate. It did somewhat succeed in his plan to run down the Lost MC into the ground, as by 2013, the gang is ran by a now meth-headed Johnny Klebitz, whose fate we all know by now. Such a shame. I feel like the dynamic between him and Johnny is done really well, as they have different approaches and priorities. Where Billy's focused on partying and making chaos, Johnny's focused on keeping the heat low and earning more money for the club. The betrayal that happens mid-game though is not really much of a surprise. Still, he's gonna be in C tier. And since we're talking about GTA 4's DLCs here, I think it's time to move on to another amazing villain whose character was set up really well but ended up a bit unsatisfactory, Ray Bulgarin. The reason I'm placing him right next to Billy is because he's the main antagonist in the Ballad of Gay Tony and not GTA 4 where he's first introduced. And after the ship he was on sinked, Bulgarin hunted Nico to gain back the money he had lost. If in GTA 4 we see him as a ruthless mob boss that can't be reasoned with, the almost complete opposite is shown in the Ballad of Gay Tony. There he's presented as a goofy and almost incompetent character. It definitely fits a lot more to have him presented that way considering the theme and atmosphere of this DLC. But his betrayal to Louise seems a bit forced, as he tries to put the blame on him and Tony for stealing his diamonds and wants them both dead. I feel like this 180 he did to Louise is done mostly for the game to have a main villain, but unlike Torini from LCS, he's definitely a good villain. And I did enjoy watching the interactions with his sister. Just take a look at this.
Got a nice place here, Mr. B.
This piece of shit. I bought it for my sister.
Hey! You bring me to this fucking country, and you keep me in an ugly cage. No one on TV lives in fucking Dukes. Then you come and move all my stuff into hallway and fill place with fucking guitars.
Shut up, bitch! Take your pills! A friend of mine is here!
He definitely makes the game better, but I'll place him in C tier. We're still in the HD universe, but we're moving up to B tier, where I'd like to talk about Steve Haynes, which I've mentioned earlier as being much better than Devin as an antagonist. There's not really any betrayal from him in comparison to other characters. He's introduced as someone who wants to gain more power and influence in the agency by exploiting the protagonists and Michael in particular because of the dirt he has on him. Sure, you could say that he betrays Michael in the mission to wrap up, but that's just him telling Michael that his usefulness to him has just ran out. Something which he made very clear when the characters first met. Not much more to add here. He's a solid villain, and I think he's also very well introduced and executed as a character. But he's not A tier either. I've decided to reserve that spot only for top characters. Some people might find this a bit controversial, but I think Big Smoke isn't all that great of a villain. His character is initially introduced as a comedic relief, especially since the you-know-what cutscene and the you-know-what memes. I am so glad that era is long gone. But in terms of a villain dynamic between him and Carl, he's not that really well written, and neither is Ryder, but by now I hope most of you know he wasn't meant to be one. He definitely raises suspicion, as nearly every time you visit him, Tenpenny and Pulaski are leaving his place. And to some people, his betrayal was very obvious from the very beginning. But my problem doesn't really stem from that. It's his lack of presence in the story after the Green Saber mission. He's only mentioned a few times, and we occasionally get the annoying call from Caesar about the Yay shipment, and yet Carl mourns the loss of them both, despite their actions. I'm conflicted with putting him even lower, but I'll keep him right in the middle. The list gets better and better, as we now move on to talk about
So this is where the coke is going? Up your nose? Hey, Vic!
an interesting character is, putting it lightly. His attitude shifts in both Vice City and Vice City Stories. He's a neurotic character, and the dynamic between him and Tommy is very similar to that of him and Vic. He feels belittled and disowned, making him do stupid acts and getting himself in trouble very frequently, and ruining the plans for both protagonists of the games. I know it's unfair to the other antagonists that I take his Vice City Stories appearance into account as well, but he plays the second most important role in both of those games, and with the help of VCS we get a much better understanding of his character. His betrayal to Tommy is more to get back at him for treating him like a little kid just like his brother did, and not cutting him enough into the action, so he sells him out to Sonny. Overall, I enjoyed his presence on screen in both games, and he's very well executed as a villain too. The next entry on the list might be perhaps surprising, and that is Jerry Martinez, also from Vice City Stories. So let's talk about him. He's also introduced in a goofy manner from the get-go, asking Vic if he's joined the army to get rich, and offering him jobs that could get him in trouble. This ends up with Vic getting kicked out of the army and forcing him to get money for Pete's treatment in other ways, which eventually leads Vic to a life of crime and even drug dealing, which he was very strongly against, and that would end up biting him in the ass later. We see and hear from Jerry far more often than other characters, as he constantly tries to get back at Vic and get rid of him, and even going as far as to kidnap his love interest Louise and harm her to get to Vic, which is much more despicable than other characters mentioned prior. He's probably not a very popular character and picked for a top antagonist, but in my opinion, he truly deserves to be more recognized. Oh, and I didn't talk about Diego Mendez, who's also killed in the final mission, but I don't have much to say about him. His brother Armando is way better, and they probably should have swapped them. Up next, we have the most heinous person in all of Liberty City, Catalina. She's introduced as the villain by betraying Claude in the first 15 seconds of the game. After all, she's an ambitious girl, and Claude is just small time. Throughout the game, we see her and her gang, the Colombians, gaining more and more power and influence in Liberty City, so much so that the streets become flooded with spank, a drug that can apparently turn people crazy. She doesn't hesitate to betray Miguel as well, showing how she doesn't care about anyone but herself. San Andreas doesn't really show that side of her, just shows more of her crazy side, so unlike Lance, I can't really use that to better understand her antagonistic side and betrayal to Claude. She's just pure crazy. She's also the type to go after those Claude cares about, which would only be Maria. Not much else to add here. Very solid character. We're now moving on to my personal top 3 for the greatest characters. Like I've mentioned earlier, number 3 and 2 spots are reserved for the A category. The number 3 spot might come as a surprise again, but it's Wu Kenny Lee from Chinatown Wars. If you haven't played this underrated game, I highly recommend it. Now let me explain why I chose Kenny as a top 3 villain. Firstly, he's a very interesting character, and very different from other bosses and mission givers that end up betraying you. Since he's Huang's uncle, he appears to be caring, and even teaches Huang the principles and values of being a triad. He's also very well spoken, using a lot of archaic terms and proverbs, showing his intelligence. He's also very business oriented and cold when talking with Huang, but he appears to empathize with him and strings him along in his ultimate plan to become the triad leader, removing any possible rival along the way, and taking advantage of Huang without him even realizing that. He is the one responsible for the death of Huang's father, so after he's caught and the truth is revealed, Kenny defends his actions as a sacrifice for something greater. The game takes us on a quest to search for the man who's murdered Huang's father, who is there from the beginning. Kenny is featured in 16 missions, making him the main antagonist with the most appearances in any game, and his on-screen appearances really solidify his character as a cold businessman with a caring facade. I'm not sure how many of you would agree with this entry as number 3. Also, fun fact, his name translated from Cantonese means fox, which speaks volumes about his character. At the number 2 spot, we have one of, if not the most beloved villain from any GTA game, a character so powerful and intimidating that he's the only antagonist to have his own theme song playing whenever he's around. Of course, I'm talking about Frank Tenpenny himself. Voiced by the amazing actor Samuel L. Jackson, Tenpenny's character has solidified himself as the most beloved antagonist in the entire franchise, and for good reason. His on-screen appearances and dialogue really emphasize the grip he's got on Carl, as well as any other character he interacts with, like Big Smoke or Ryder. We start off San Andreas arriving back home in Los Santos after spending 5 years on the East Coast, only to be greeted by Frank Tenpenny and his 2 other Crash Team members, Pulaski and the newly recruited Officer Hernandez. Carl has no choice when it comes to taking orders from Tenpenny, because otherwise, he would get framed for the murder of Officer Penderbury, who was killed by all 3 members of the Crash Team just as Carl had arrived in Los Santos. So he has to do Tenpenny's bidding to avoid getting trialed for murder, and later he even has Sweet incarcerated and used as ransom in order to keep CJ working for him. He uses both the Ballas and the Grove Street families to gain influence and power, and start an operation of flooding the streets with drugs, as well as using Carl specifically on more than one occasion to get rid of anyone who threatens Tenpenny's career by exposing him with evidence. During the mission End of the Line, Tenpenny confronts Carl about leaving the city, and after Big Smoke's crackdown ends up completely destroyed, a chase between him and Carl, who's joined by Sweet, ensues. A chase that ends with probably the most iconic speech of any other villain.
Assholes! You never understood what I did. 50 of me, and this town would be okay. I took the trash out. I did. And I do it all again.
But if Tenpenny is such a great character, then who is number 1? Well, we haven't talked about one particular game so far, and that is Grand Theft Auto 4. So my number 1 pick for the absolute greatest villain in a GTA game has to go to Dmitry Rascalov, who, in my opinion, is the best written antagonist, perfectly introduced into the plot of the game, and is absolutely the most evil and unredeeming character of them all. A spineless rat is probably not a good enough description for Dmitry. Though at first he isn't presented as one, he's simply Mikhail Faustin's right-hand man, helping him better run his business across Liberty City and keeping things above water, as Mikhail isn't really a good leader. However, after Niko is sent by Mikhail to kill Lenny Petrovic, son of Kenny Petrovic, a very powerful Russian mobster, Dmitry approaches Niko, claiming that after a sit-down with Kenny, which we don't know if it ever happened or not, he would spare him and Roman if he killed Mikhail, as he was the one to deliver the orders to Niko. The cutscene of this particular mission, named Master and the Molotov, has probably one of the most interesting and impacting delivery from Dmitry's character.
You know, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that we must obey the rules of the game. We can pick the game, Niko Bellic, but we cannot change the rules.
Though his appearance isn't very intimidating, he manages to be the worst antagonist of them all. But in a good way, obviously, otherwise he wouldn't be in the tier of his own. His personality is very cold, a calculated man, and very business-oriented, as well as having a thirst for power and money, which makes him be disloyal and betray everyone around him, even those he works with, and has absolutely no moral compass. A character that would do anything to save his own skin and increase his status. You might say he's not all that different from someone like Tenpenny, who also didn't care much about the people around him, like Pulaski, who's always seen around with. But Dmitry is levels above that. At one point in the story, he orders Johnny Klebitz through his goons to kidnap Roman and bring him to a warehouse in Bohan, claiming that Ashley's debts would be absolved if he did the job, or she'd be dead if he refused, doing 2 heinous acts at once. Oh, and let's not forget how he burned down both Roman's apartment as well as his cab business, and his numerous calls and texts throughout the story that are meant to be threats to Niko and those he cares about, mainly his cousin. Dmitry Rascalov is by far the greatest villain ever, and the part that he plays in the story is undeniably crucial, thus also making it the greatest plot in any GTA game. And this earns him the number 1 spot, sitting all the way up in the S rank category. So, this is the final rankings list. I'd like to mention the fact that C and B rankings could be changed around, and they're not exactly set in stone. I think they are somewhat equally great, but they each have different ups and downs. This video was a bit different from my usual content, and I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said in the beginning, this only covered the main villains of the game, so I didn't include characters like Ricardo Diaz, Ryder, and many others. So if you want to see something like that, please let me know in the comment section down below. And of course, I'd love to know your opinion on the rankings, if you agree or if you think the order should have been different. And if you want to see more, leave a like and consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching.
So this is what the dream feels like. This is the victory we longed for.